Well, thank you very much indeed, Mary Elena, President of the Workers' Group, Luke, dear colleagues, dear friends. It's firstly really a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. Thank you for the invitation to come in and join you as you reach the end of this important event. I'm sorry I haven't been able to be with you up until this point. I've literally just got back to Geneva at lunchtime, so it's really very fortunate that I've got the chance to share with you some ideas. And I want to thank Luke Kortebeck for that very comprehensive statement of the concerns that you've addressed in the course of this week. It is, of course, quite. It's at the same time, it could be very easy to respond to what Luke has said, but it's also quite difficult to do it in a way which I think adds value to your conversation. There's very, very little that Luke has just said which I would disagree with, of course, in terms of the diagnosis of the problems of inequality and growing inequality. We all know, we're all living that reality. But the question which keeps coming back, we can diagnose the problems, we can identify the things that we want to make happen. We have a great deal more difficulty saying how we're going to make those things happen. And if we're all honest, how it has come about that this continued inequality has grown, and all of us, and I'm not pointing the finger just at the labour movement, I wouldn't do that, ILO, labour movement and the rest have been incapable or haven't got it right because it's continuing. And I just want to start with a couple of reflections about what's happened in recent years, because I think there's reason both to be worried but also to be encouraged by some of the developments. Let's go back to this, the crisis that hit us all 2008. I think what is quite interesting about what we lived through 2008, and I was sitting in a different seat in 2008, we all saw that the crisis that exploded in 2008 and the consequences of it, or the crisis itself is still with us, had many of its roots in inequality. Undue indebtedness, stagnation of wages, concentrated income distribution. The crisis was born out of inequality. And I think that was widely recognised. And around that time, and it was when the G20 was born, it was when the international labour movement began to engage with the G20, there was widespread political recognition that things had to change. Do you remember all of those speeches? Didn't just come from the left, came from the right, came from President Sarkozy, came even from President Bush, that there was something badly wrong with globalization, that things could not continue as before. Very strong echoes of some of the messages that had come out of the ILO's own World Commission on the Social Dimension of Globalization. And around that time, I think many of us thought in the trade union movement, it was certainly my view, that we had real opportunity around 2008, 2009 to reset the global economy, to make, Luke, you've referred to it now, what is still needed, a fundamental readjustment of the manner in which the global economy functions, an opportunity. Now, I think a few years later on, as we reach the end of 2013, I think we have to worry that that moment passed. That moment passed. I think it reached a sort of a peak, and then it passed. And unfortunately, what we have seen is a continuation of growing inequality. We've seen a continuation of growing unemployment in the world, and we know that despite talk of recovery, global unemployment continues to increase. That moment of resetting the global economy just didn't seem to work out. And here's the paradox. At a certain point, and there was a tilting point, I guess around 2010, when sovereign debt issues began to become the driver of international policy making, there came a tilting point when the international policy agenda actually began to contribute to further inequality rather than reducing inequality. And that is a trajectory which has continued, I would say, for the last 3 or 4 years. You've seen it in the austerity policies. I'm impressed, Luke, when you say austerity policies in more than 100 countries. It's not a small or a regional, it's not a European phenomenon, it's a global phenomenon. The policy agenda seems to be pushing inequality further forward, not reducing it. So that's a discouraging piece of the story. I think the encouraging piece of the story, and I'm picking this up, and I don't know if you're picking it up as well, is that there is wider and wider acceptance that inequality is a problem. Now, that's always been, and quite naturally, rightly and properly so, the view of the trade union movement. It's also been the view expressed strongly by the ILO. But let's be honest, we have not always encountered from governments, from all international organisations, a recognition that inequality was a problem. Today, I think that recognition is much more strongly and widely felt, and it's coming from some perhaps unlikely sources and with some, I think, interesting nuances. It is encouraging, to me at least, to hear organisations such as the International Monetary Fund expressing serious concern about growing inequality, not just for reasons of social justice, which I think are the first reason that we should be paying attention, but also because there is a growing, a dawning recognition that growing inequality at the dimensions it exists today, is economically dysfunctional. And so we see serious work being done, not just in the ILO, but elsewhere, on why it is that high levels of inequality actually are a brake on economic growth. You know, they might not be asking the right questions for the right reasons, but they're asking the right questions, and we should welcome that at least. And it gives us an opening. So I think inequality issues are on the agenda again, in new ways and for different reasons, and I think, and I want to challenge you again in this, how do we do it? Not what needs to be done, but how do we do it? We shouldn't be going away from this meeting, and the ILO cannot content itself with simply putting forward a wish list of what we would like to see happen. We have to have an agenda of action to make it happen. So I think we do have, with this renewed attention on inequality, some real opportunities. I just came back from Africa, visited 4 countries, 3 of which are rapidly growing African economies, where clearly rapid economic growth, and we're talking about 7% plus, is not translating into increased living standards and is generating higher inequality. That's bad. What is good is that governments, not just ministers of labour, but prime ministers, presidents, and indeed employers, are beginning to look at these issues as something that matters and something which needs to be addressed. Now, let me just say something about some of the areas that Luke touched upon. I won't do it in detail, but just to perhaps begin to construct this agenda of fighting inequality and try to focus us on the how of the question, how we change these things. But it's quite clear to us all, I think, that many of the roots of growing inequality, the fundamental roots of inequality, are clearly in the world of work, and that makes it ILO business. We know that there's been a fundamental shift away from returns to labour, and returns to capital have grown correspondingly. We know as well that returns to labour are becoming more polarised. That is to say that higher wage earners are doing better, lower wage earners are doing worse, and sometimes, regrettably, our collective bargaining outcomes contribute to that polarisation. It's worth bearing in mind. Some would see this as an inevitable consequence of an increasingly integrated global economy where returns to valuable skills are prized and returns to unskilled labour are simply skills or low skills in great supply are naturally driven down. The question is, how do we intervene to change that notion of a natural order? Well, the most obvious one, of course, and Luke, you've referred to it at length, and I know it's been at the centre of your discussions this week, is to do with collective bargaining. And if there was one issue which I think we have to confront together, it is protecting and extending collective bargaining. It is historically, and I hope you'll agree with me, I hope I'm not saying anything controversial, it is historically the method, the instrument that the labour movement has used to create social justice in the distribution of income. That's how workers win for themselves, through the exercise of their rights, a fair share of what they produce. And we know it's been eroded. We know that collective bargaining coverage is falling. Some of it's to do with the lowered strength of our organisations, of your organisations. We need to look at that, look at it head on and understand it. But it's also to do with policy choices. It's also to do, some cases, with international policy advocacy by international organisations. Mary-Elena, I was in your country recently, and the figures they gave me, it's quite stunning, that collective bargaining coverage has decreased by no less than 80%, 80%, since 2009, 2010? 2010. And that wasn't because you were the Minister of Labour, I know. But it's dramatic. It's dramatic. And we know what lies behind that. We know the policy choices that have brought that about. And it's continuing. So collective bargaining, and we all know what the responsibilities of the ILO are. And I got criticised for it when I spoke in Portugal. The responsibilities of the ILO are to promote collective bargaining. It's constitutional. It's not an option, it's the option. It's what we should be doing. And there is an increasing push out there to say, look, collective bargaining if you want it, but individual contracts, that's just as good. Or even that collective bargaining outcomes are actually prejudicial to good economic performance. That centralised bargaining system do not take proper account of the diversity of enterprise situations. We know all of these arguments. We have to confront them, and we have some arguments to win. And in that regard, and I want to thank Luke for referring to it, I think the decision that we've taken, and I know it wasn't an easy decision for the workers' group to come on board with, but the decision that we've taken to set up a centralised research capacity, to strengthen the ILO's policy analytical capacities, can help us. We are in a position, I think, to, on the basis of well-based analytical research, produce the evidence that makes the case for collective bargaining. It's one of the things we have to do, but it's one of the most important things that we have to do. So I hope that the ILO is positioning itself, it's my intention, to engage in the battle for collective bargaining, because that's what it is, with more strength. We cannot argue only on the basis of principle. The principles we stand by, but we have to adduce the economic evidence that this works and it's good for our societies. And I think if we put our principle and our policy and analytical capacities together, we've got a much stronger set of arguments to present. So collective bargaining is key. I also believe that, of course, minimum wage policy is important. Minimum wages are a big issue around the world right now. Sometimes people are pushing them down. In other places, people are using them as a positive policy instrument. And sometimes sitting in Europe, we forget that, those of us who sit in Europe. But there is positive things happening in minimum wage policies in other parts of the world. We have to get the right mix between minimum wages and collective bargaining, of course. We know that's a complex interaction. But I do think as well, and Luke, you've referred to it as well, that we need to give a little bit more thought to how to promote the notion of a living wage. The minimum wage is one thing, the living wage is another. And surprise, surprise, if you read the 1919 Constitution, it's there. It's not something we invented this year or last year. It's there. The notion that people who work for a living should take home a wage which allows them a decent life is something that the ILO has stood for nearly a century. I think we need to unwrap that idea and see what it can result in today. I was quite interested to see, and I'm not going to go into the corporate social responsibility agenda in detail, but one multinational announced its intention, I think last week, to pay all of its workers in supply chains a living wage. Now, that was a unilateral decision, which you might say was a unilateral corporate social responsibility decision. And you might not like that type of decision. However, that was a bloody good decision, and one we should applaud. Life is never as easy as sometimes we want to make it. The last piece of this is social protection. I think that the initiative that has been begun on the social protection floor, which certainly predates my time at the head of the ILO, is actually gaining traction. Again, it involved, when we adopted that recommendation, some difficult debates for the trade union movement. We were worried about how it might affect acquired rights in social security, which have been hard won by Labour. But we're doing some very interesting work, and again, as I move around, I see that not only is the notion of a social protection floor, the idea of a guaranteed income provision is actually beginning to produce some results. I saw it in Mozambique this week. And we're working, again, I don't want to get the wrong idea, we're working with International Monetary Fund very positively on a social protection floor. And it does have the potential to lift a lot of people out of poverty. So again, it's part of the equation. It's not all of the response, but it's a bit of the response. Mary-Elena, I've gone on for quite a long time. There's a lot more that could be said. A lot more that could be said about the financialization of the global economy. We know that's pushed inequality. We know also that fiscal policy, tax policy, is another part of the answer. I think that also falls within the interests of the ILO. I'm quite encouraged that the international community is taking seriously tax evasion and aggressive tax avoidance by multinational business. It was one of the, for me, surprising but encouraging parts of the recent G20 meeting in Russia, in St. Petersburg, where you really heard governments challenging business on getting on board, on tackling profit shifting, cheating, if you like, on tax. And it wasn't just the progressive governments. I heard, I don't think we're betraying any secrets here, the Prime Minister of my country, the United Kingdom, Mr. Cameron, wagging his finger at the business people and saying, this tax agenda for business is your agenda, get on board. He then wagged his finger at the workers and said, get on board for social welfare reform, but that's another question. But this is moving. The G20 also put inequality, minimum wages, into its declaration when the leaders met in St. Petersburg. It's a reflection of the fact that this is coming back onto our agenda. Colleagues, I could go on for a long while, but I think there is reason to have some optimism that there's a bit more opportunity. There are hooks of opportunity to start putting inequality into the international policy agenda, into the work of course, your trade union organisations and in the ILO. And the last thing I want to say is that, and you know this, but I'll say it anyway, we need the workers' group, Luke, under your leadership and Raquel's leadership, to push this agenda. I don't need to encourage you, but we need you to do it. Here in the ILO, we will be responsive. We will be looking to work with you in that regard, through our research work, through the new enterprise initiative that you've referred to, and much else. We are reforming the organisation. We are innovating. We want to make the ILO more influential in the global policy debates. I think we can do that, but I think we have to work together. And ACTRAV as well, Mary-Elena, the team that you lead and who have done a great job in organising this event, are part of the equation. So let's go forward with determination. This event will certainly contribute to our efforts, And again, thank you for all of you, lots of friends in the room, for having come from around the world to add your thoughts to this endeavour. This is going to be, the outcomes of this meeting will certainly be an important contribution to the work that awaits us ahead. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, and I just want to say on behalf of our colleagues that how much we appreciate